Hello, Internet. Rare day shoot for the three hamsters in the man suit. You'll notice I'm not going to be staring off into the middle distance quite as bad now, I don't think. It's hard to tell on the smaller camera, but I'm using my phone instead of my wife's iPhone, my wife's tablet, because her tablet's for work, and they're the days she works. So, there you go. Today we're going to talk about characters, casts, and things of that nature, as well as briefly, hopefully, touch on the importance of character of group makeup. First off, if you haven't watched the video before, I'm going to ramble, and if you have watched the video before, be prepared. Character's most important person in your story. I don't really think I need to go too much into definition of the concept of character. It is the most important person or people in your story. It includes people you don't name. Everyone who has an impact on the story is technically a character, and in a lot of circumstances, the setting is also a character. Anything that can interact with the story in a meaningful way is technically a character. The more important the character, the more thought you should put into their backstory and their personality. The more fantastic the setting, the more the setting kind of becomes a character that you have to consider. All that said, real quick, we're going to talk on cast. Now, I can't really tell you how you need to make a character, because characters is your voice, and I can't. Everyone's going to have a different voice when they write. So, your character is your voice. Whatever feels comfortable, do that. But let's talk a little bit about knowing what you're doing. Because that, and I'm not telling, sound like I'm talking from authority here. What I mean by knowing what you're doing is being aware of what you're doing, not me telling you how to do it. Which the whole point of this series is me to tell you how I think you should do things. So, circular logic, and I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about. Again, if you've seen my videos before, there should be no surprise at this. I'm talking a little about cast real quick. In the concept of a horror story, there's an important concept that you have. Most stories have the same basic structure when it comes to the cast. You have antagonists and protagonists, and you're meant to empathize with the protagonists and dislike the antagonists. Antagonists can be likable, but at the end of the day, you don't want the antagonists to win. Well, your reader doesn't. Or your viewer, you know what the fuck I'm saying. Whereas the protagonist is generally the person that the characters, the reader is following. The reader is going to follow your protagonist through the story. That doesn't mean hero. It means the person who is actively, who is the active character in the story. You want your main character to be the active force in the story. The antagonist is by and large reactionary while also doing their own actions, but their primary influence on the story will be to react to the main character. Again, we're talking kind of in fantasy, well, not again, but we're talking kind of in fantasy, things like that, but even in like, look at Die Hard. You know, John McClane he reacts to their arrival, and from that point forward, he is largely the assertive character because he's the one we're following. Yes, they're all doing things that are active, but we're not following that part of the story as much. We're following, for the most part, their reaction to him. Same with a lot of action movies. Lord of the Rings, you don't really ever see what the bad guys are doing. You kind of just know they're doing things, and the characters find out they're doing things. And then you encounter forces that are reacting to the things the heroes are doing, the protagonists are doing. You absolutely can have the protagonist be a villain. You can have the antagonists be heroes. It all depends on how you're framing it and what you're doing. But in the end of the day, your protagonist needs to be the character that people empathize with. Can you make an empathetic villain? Of course you can. A lot of people empathize with Magneto, and he is, by and large, traditionally a villain. Not as many people empathize with Dr. Doom, but I am one of them. because I think Reed Richards is a dick. But in horror, you have a secondary type of cast, and theoretically you could put it into other things too, but at the end of the day, the cathartic cast, as I refer to it, is a cast that exists to watch suffer. Seems a bit mean, but look at the video game that came out last year, Until Dawn. Look at a lot of horror series. You will almost always have the main protagonist in most stories, but at the end of the day, the cast in a lot of horror stories, especially in movies, are there to die in inventive and exciting ways that you are meant to kind of cheer for. So they're made to be dickheads. They're written, they're created, they're styled to be massive pricks. A lot of the Cabin in the Wood style movies literally framed them on the worst people you knew from high school. So there's always going to be at least someone in there like, motherfucker, yes, get that guy. There's not always going to be a protagonist in those stories. A lot of times in those stories, technically speaking, the monster is the protagonist. Jason Voorhees, Freddy Krueger, Michael Myers, they are, well, Michael Myers less so. But Jason Voorhees, Freddy Krueger, they're kind of the protagonists of their stories. We're not following the survivors. We're following those guys, because they're the interesting characters. They're the characters you're meant to be cheering for, whether or not you identify with them. And then they'll include one character, typically a female character, who can kind of defeat the bad guy, that you can kind of cheer for them too, and give you a lot of backstory on how tragic they are, while everyone else was just kind of a massive dickhead, and no one really gave a shit. Except, of course, the main character, because they are such good people. That's what a cathartic cast is. The cathartic cast is there to die, die in ways that are creative and fun, so that the person consuming the media can cheer on, and also kind of get an idea of how powerful the monster is, because by and large in those types of stories, the monster or the setting is the main character. A zombie apocalypse, by and large, the main character is the zombie apocalypse, and the side characters are just there to kind of basically be sidekicks to that character. And that's where we're going to get into the idea of setting as character. The more you move away from the real world, the more your setting becomes a character. Now, not necessarily in their protagonist-antagonist structure, but they do have a backstory that you need to take into consideration. They have a personality, and they have an aesthetic that you need to keep consistent, like I was talking about in a prior video with the consistent internal mythology. The more fantastic you become, the more your setting becomes a character. Douglas Adams actually did a video game called Starship Titanic, which the video game main character actually is the Titanic, and you just kind of play through different perspectives, I assume. It came out in like 1985 for a computer that I don't think I think it was like a Mac in 1985, and I didn't get a computer until 1998, so I haven't played it. But that was one of the things he was really proud of, was creating a game where the main character was a starship that had no personality. But it just doesn't talk. Personality is more than conversation. It's also attire. It's also body language. It's also aesthetic. It's also all sorts of fucking things. Now that we've gone over those ideas, how do you build a cast? Well, if you want a lot of blog attention, diversity is the way to go. Put as many random different things as you can into the story, bearing in mind that the more outlandish they are from your norm, and the less you think you're going to be able to write them, the more that's going to bite you in the ass when the story gets published or produced. My feeling on it is write what would be appropriate for the story. If you're setting a story in third century China, you really shouldn't put a whole lot of Africans or whites in it. If you're setting a story, if you're writing a story based on Marco Polo, maybe he shouldn't be a martial artist spy maybe, he's okay being just a merchant who may or may not have been real. Um, but at the same time, looking at mythology and folklore, keep that in mind if you're going to be setting a historical setting or a fantasy setting set on history. Aztecs, Quetzalcoatl. If you're going to do a story around the arrival of Quetzalcoatl, remember a very important thing. Quetzalcoatl was fair-skinned, blonde-haired, and blue-eyed, which is why when the Spaniards showed up, they thought that they might be Quetzalcoatl because they looked like him. And again, that's going back to the idea of, I don't actually know if I've gone into that. It goes into the idea of researching folklore and things like that if you're going to set it in history. If you're not setting it in history, set it in modern day, look at the demographics for your area. If you want to set a story in Phoenix, Arizona, maybe go to Wikipedia or go online and do a demographic search and see what the population breakdown is of different things. And include those things in your story, even if they're just side characters. One of my favorite characters in Sherry Priest's modern day series, she wrote a vampire series. I can't remember the name of the first book. I think it's like Bloodshot or something. But there's a Navy SEAL drag queen in it. And yeah, I know, drag queen is a derogatory term for some people now, but that's actually what he is. He dresses in drag in a drag show in Savannah, Georgia. And she has to go to him for help. And so there's this 6.5-foot tall Navy SEAL, former Navy SEAL, who now does drag shows professionally. It's just an interesting concept, but she knew a lot of people who did drag shows, and so she's able to portray a character accurately who can do that. So if you want a character who does drag shows, you might want to go to a drag show and see if you can't talk to one of the performers or things like that. I'm currently in the process of trying to find, there's apparently a local voodoo circle in Seattle, in Everett. And so I'm in the process of trying to contact or find out how to contact them to kind of get an idea of what modern voodoo's like for one of the series I want to kind of poke at. And it's authenticity is going to get you a lot further than anything else. I go to a lot of comic blogs and things like that because I have a lot of time and I am very tired a lot of days. So I spend a lot of time just kind of scrolling through stuff. And there is a big push that diversity is more important than anything. What's most important is authenticity. A character who's in a story who is adding diversity to the story, but written in an inauthentic manner, is going to detract from your story. It's as simple as that. It really is. If you have a character in your story who is there just to be there, it's a lot easier in a TV show or a movie because the actor can bring their own experiences, but if you don't have their experiences, if you aren't willing to research it, maybe stick to European medieval, or be willing to just ignore it. A very popular thing to do is just never mention skin color for characters. But you still have to mention, well, you don't have to, but, if you're going to have a love story, you have to mention their orientation, unless you're never going to mention sex either. So it's a whole goddamn fucking clusterfuck of mess if you start getting into that and you start letting it color your perceptions on how you should write and what you should write. Now, this isn't me saying don't do a diverse cast. This is me saying do a diverse cast well, or don't do a diverse cast. If you can't do something well, you shouldn't do it. But you can't get better at something unless you do it. So, read it over, send it to a friend, send it to someone you know, talk them through it, and like I've said before in the dialogue section, maybe have someone read lines out loud. Compare lines to movies you like. A good way of creating a cast that you can voice real well is basing characters on actors or characters from movies or portrayals from movies. It's one of the things my brother liked to do is basically picture an actor in his mind for a certain character, and that would help him write the voice for that character to an extent. My brother wasn't real great. He had a couple issues when it came to actual social cues. He would have been diagnosed autistic in this day and age, and legitimately so. So his ability to kind of read body language kind of filtered into the stories, and so everyone's kind of just talking, and there's no body language or vocal communication. It's just words, words, words. But all in all, it is what it is. Or was what it was. But yeah, I mean, if you look at Nick Fury from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Nick Fury was originally based on Steve McQueen, back in the Steve McQueen and other actors of that era who were the quintessential badasses. And so that's who they designed Nick Fury off of. And so when the Ultimate series came out and they were redesigning all the characters, they asked themselves, who's the quintessential badass in movies today? Samuel L. Jackson. Now, personally, I think they should have got the guy who played Cisco from Deep Space Nine to play that particular Nick Fury, because he would have done it probably for less money, and I don't know, I'm a little tired of Samuel L. Jackson being the badass. One of my favorite roles for him is Jurassic Park, because he's just a person. And Die Hard 3. I loved him in Die Hard 3. Getting into the ums again, so you can see him starting to reach the end. But the main idea is ultimately know what you're trying to write, know who you're trying to write in it. If you want to include a character that you don't share their experiences, research their experiences. If you want to write a character who has a family in a nursing home, you can find blogs of people who have family in nursing homes. You can go to nursing homes and talk to the administrator about the types of people who come in. More than likely, I've worked in a couple nursing homes. If your only work experience is a cash register, maybe you're going to have to do research to write that accountant you want to write. It isn't a bad thing to do research. It's actually an extraordinarily helpful thing, and it will enhance your writing, but you need to make sure you understand who your characters are. Now, you don't necessarily have to know it at the beginning, but you have to know it by the end. When you read back through the story, then you should always read back through your stories, as much as I don't ever watch these videos again. When you read back through the story, you need to be able to look at that character at every point in that story and say, that is the same person, or this person changed at this point. You can see their arc clearly. If all of a sudden your character goes from hating everyone to suddenly being a pacifist who wants to save everyone, you need to have a justification for that, or else it's going to be jarring, and it's going to damage that fourth wall, as we've discussed a couple times. That's pretty much it when it comes to the broad strokes on character. Like I said, character's a matter of voice. Your voice will determine your character, and so if you want to do a character who's drunken lout, then that's fine, but don't then turn them into a raging hippie if you don't have a reason for it. And simply changing who you wanted to write doesn't work. You need to change the characters. And again, that comes back to the voice and the perspective of the character. Third person, it's a lot easier to change characters. First person, a little bit more difficult. Other than that, have a nice day. Don't do anything stupid, I guess, if you're gonna enjoy it at least. And next time, man.